All right, welcome back, everybody. Here we are, Paranormal Radio, the last broadcast of 2008. We're going to usher in 2009 out there on the East Coast. So if you're out there on the East Coast, all of you, really, thanks for joining me tonight. So, anyway, all right, tonight, my guest, Clif, from halfpasthuman.com. You also know his other website, urbansurvival.com, by the way. And we're going to be talking about 2009 global coastal events, by the way. Now, if you're not familiar with WebBot technology, with what he had been working on for many, many years, as far as forecasting the future, in a sense. Basically, the WebBot technology would scour through all these message boards, and it would pick up on key phrases of how people were speaking, which kind of unlocked and decoded, possibly predicting events, in a sense, or giving us kind of a look into what the hell's going on or what could be happening. Very interesting stuff. We've had Clif on a couple of times. Always enjoy talking to him. Clif, thanks for joining me for the end of 2008.
No problem at all. Glad to be here.
So, 2008, of course, has been a very rocky ride, and everyone's hoping that 2009 will fare better than 2008. But before we get into any of that stuff, for those out there that are not familiar with the WebBot technology, bring them up to speed on it.
Well, basically what we do is we look for shifts in language. We work on the premise that everyone is psychic to some degree, and even those people that don't know they're psychic are leaking out some of their prescient visions in the particular choice of words evidenced over time. So they might be discussing Aunt Maria's apple pie one week on a garden forum related to apples, but within that language, within that discussion, they may leak out some key phrases in that particular lexicon. Then we start getting into some complications there, because basically what we do is we operate here on set theory, so we gather up vast quantities of words, hundreds and hundreds of millions of words, and we sort them into all these little sets, and subsets and half sets and fuzzy sets, and then we start sort of distilling them all down into a big, thick, syrupy mass that resolves into these basic human archetypes that we think are common across cultures. And because we're doing this on the internet, it is pan-cultural, pan-global. Mm-hmm. And we can't rely on English, although that's my native language. We have to branch out and include all languages, and so we're broadening that particular thing out. Basically what we're looking for is the shift in language. Why this particular word in this rather generic discussion on that particular week?
Right.
And by looking at these subtle shifts and examining them with visual interface that I've designed, we can come up with basic what we think is that little distilled bits of psychicness that leaks out of everybody. And it appears to have some validity. And we find that it's in use in other theories, Dean Radin's theory about the prescient ability to sense people coming in the door, or you know when you're going to get a phone call, mm-hmm. or you know a half a second before the accident. I believe you had that experience.
Yes, the truck incident, which was very strange. It was a couple of days before we had you on the program last time.
Yes, and so we all have these experiences, and we can leak them out. And that really is where we think we're into the metaphysical within the domain of reality, and we're sort of feeling around with very crude instruments into the metaphysical world, and we're able to pull out some good levels of description. And this is where it gets a little bit fuzzy. We have to apply a disclaimer here, because we're working in the area of radical linguistics. So we don't really get a description of an event per se. What we really get are hints as to the kinds of words that will be used after the event to describe it.
Yes.
So it's sort of like looking at a fuzzy view of a newspaper written the day after a big event, and trying to decipher from our little fuzzy viewpoint the words being used to describe that. Now, if they're describing it inaccurately, then we're also going to get an inaccurate description. Mm-hmm. So if it's an unknown kind of thing, or it's curious, or a conundrum of some sort, then we'll also get that level of information coming through, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's also gauged on the level of accuracy as far as some of the words that come out after an event, or that you've predicted before the event, and then after, it's like some of them are 80%, some of them are 50%.
Correct. It's not 100% all the time, right. Usually when we're very right, we're usually spectacularly so. I mean, it's staggering. Yes. And then we have a varying degree of failure from that point on. Take this idea of these twin earthquakes that we predicted. We thought for sure we were going to get these twin earthquakes appearing in the December 10th through 12th time frame. And as a matter of fact, what we actually ended up with was virtually all the linguistics of the twin earthquakes being fulfilled over the course of the whole month of December, with a spike around the 17th.
Yes.
So this is not to say that we were correct, because we were wrong. There were no earthquakes as described. However, a lot of the other language that we had lumped in with the earthquakes, such as isolation for the Pacific Northwest and this kind of thing, did indeed show up, but it turned out to be related to extreme snow levels.
Well, was there any account for, I mean, all the activity that's going on at Yellowstone right now that has...
Oh, sure. Yeah. We're actually picking up all kinds of earthquake language all over the planet. There were twin earthquakes in San Diego. There were twin earthquakes in right underneath a volcano in Chile. We had twin earthquakes appearing in a couple of other small areas, but they were all small.
Yes.
And what we had seen ahead of time was a whole lot of language, so to speak, about isolation and destruction and this kind of thing. And then we also, of course, in the same little area, saw the information about earthquakes, and our little monkey minds put the two together. And they were actually separate linguistic threads. And if we'd examined them that way, we might have been able to pick up on the extreme snow levels and the extreme cold in this area.
Yes.
Now, we had predicted a very costly, in terms of dollar, cold spell that would take over the Northeast and dominate this winter and actually start sometime in late November and continue on. We were pretty accurate on that, the power loss and everything, although we thought the power loss would be due to lack of oil deliveries rather than loss of electricity.
Right.
Again, we applied logic at the time of the forecast, and it was an extension of high oil costs and so on, because that's how far back it was that we made those forecasts. But we were accurate about the loss of power and heat and opening up schools for heat shelters and this sort of thing, although we applied the wrong cause.
Yes.
So if we can just get our own monkey minds out of the way, we could probably raise our level of accuracy a little bit.
Right. And you can
sort of makes sense.
You can definitely get information both off the accuracy and the inaccuracy as well. The inaccuracy as far as looking at different ways to make the accuracy a little bit more, or just looking at the information in a sense in a different way, right?
Correct, because it is a work in progress, and we're trying to fine-tune it. We have a bunch of postulates, some of which we have to throw out, because they're seemingly good predictors of a particular kind of a pattern, but they just don't pan out over time. Or the pattern was so short-lived, we just happened to catch it, and it faded, and there's a whole lot we don't know about this kind of thing.
Right. Considering the fact that whenever you started this, it was for basically the stock market, and everything that has happened with the stock market thus far in the last few months, were you getting information about some of the stuff that came down the pipeline for...
Oh, sure. We'd identified back in July of 2007 the specific date on which the release language would change in October of 2008, wherein the whole world would acknowledge that we had a credit collapse and a crisis. And that was the date that the Icelandic currency also collapsed on October 7th. So we found that out a year ahead of time. So no, to a certain extent, you start the show by saying, well, it's been a tumultuous year. And in my line of work, I have to say, for me personally, that's not necessarily true, because I see a lot of this stuff coming. So it's like, oh yeah, ho-hum, here it is, now let's get beyond it.
It's kind of like knowing that when the train is going to arrive at 8 o'clock, you know it's going to be there. Everyone else is going, oh, hey, the train's here. And you're like, I knew it was coming.
Yeah. And it can be somewhat disconcerting. It sets you apart, and you don't live in the time matrix that a lot of other people do.
Well, with all of this, I mean, it kind of I don't know, how should I say this? It kind of brings up the question of reality itself. I mean, it seems as if, though, everyone talks about everyone has their own reality, or you can make your own reality. And for the most part, that is kind of true, but there seems to be an underlying reality that no one really knows about, but briefly, everyone kind of taps into it a little bit.
Yeah, there's also, it's a misnomer to think, though, that no one knows about it, because it's been highly documented. It's just not in our Western framework as it is controlled by the powers that be.
Yes.
Because if you want to really understand how reality works, go read Patanjali's Science of Yoga, or some of the books written by the Buddhists where they do nothing but observe and analyze how there is a universal common consciousness that we all use, for instance, in shaping material reality around us. Yeah. And if you want to think of it this way, it's all these giant templates that are brought into existence to help create reality in front of our eyes.
Right.
And much of what they say agrees with our belated understanding of quantum physics.
Very true. That's a whole other bag of mix of goodness in there as well.
But at a core level, it is one of the precepts upon which our work is based.
Yes.
Because in a material world where atoms actually were little rocks whizzing around in space, none of what I do would be feasible or possible. It is only feasible and possible in a planetary or a universal matrix in which there is an apparent reality of little rocks whizzing around in space, but is it in fact an energetic collision, just a collision of vast reverberations, if you will, within the energy of the whole planet.
Yes.
So you see people, for instance, especially in what I term the woo-woo world, which is the alternative media taken to its extreme. And not necessarily in any way to cast aspersions, but just merely to label and provide a set that allows me to think about these people in a particular way. Mm-hmm. You see a lot of these guys talk about timelines. And from my perspective and that of the Buddhist and the yogis of the past, timelines don't exist per se. There is no such thing as reality in the sense of a river flowing towards you. There's no such thing as time behind you. The idea of the present moment exists, and everybody hears this, but they fail to comprehend what it really means, and that is that the present moment is being created fractional milliseconds before our perception of it. And it is that gap, that little spark gap, if you will, if you knew, for instance, the timing of an engine, you could set up a resonator and disable that engine. Mm-hmm. Or you could, in fact, use that engine to power a radio just because of its spark gap.
Yes.
And that kind of thing exists in reality. And that's kind of what we're using to power our work, if that makes sense.
Which is really interesting because you're mixing the technology with something that, cultures, religious leaders and cultures have been talking about for a very long time.
Yeah, and we just kind of stumbled over it.
Yes. Look what I found. So I know that, and we talked about this before, and a lot of people ask questions about this, is whenever it comes to things like slang or even maybe just different terminology for things. Is that a stumbling block in the data that you put?
That's where most of our processing is, because what we have to do is we have to reduce things down to archetypes.
Yes.
And that's where this massive concept of the set theory arises. Basically what we do is we aggregate words and turn them into 4-digit hexadecimal numbers simply because it's easier to deal with hexadecimal integers as opposed to ASCII text for a particular word. Mm-hmm. And hexadecimal integer is a known size, and we can accommodate hundreds of millions of words at any given time within that range. Mm-hmm. And the hexadecimal integer is computationally easy to flow through computer software. And we sort these into a giant database, a SQL Server database, and then we hit that database with Prolog programs looking for particular kinds of sets, but then in turn display this information in an IntelliCAD artificial reality as a bunch of pixels of various different hues and this kind of thing. In order to achieve that, we basically have that huge stumbling block of reducing the different concepts, the slangs, and so on, down into these archetypes. But that is where we derive our timing sequence, because you've really hit on it. You have different slang, for instance, that's the bleeding edge of all language. Mm-hmm. The kids are creating new language which will flow through the generation, stick with their generation, and die with their generation, but also dominate during their generation. And when we die, our slang drops off and becomes archaic. And basically what slang is the concept of it's not your papa's emotion. So you don't use your papa's language to describe how you're feeling about things. You invent new words and terms among yourself and your peers. Mm-hmm. Make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so if we find slang language developing around a particular archetype, we know we've got what we call immediacy values, that it's a very sharp